"Morning!" shrilled the eager young gunner, just a little bit too enthusiastically for Ernie's liking, hoisting her diminutive khaki frame up and into the cab and slotting herself down behind the ancient hulking cannon like a dribble of milk being poured from a bowl. She pulled on her harness and buckled herself in, her fingers moving like a video stuck on fast forward, an overdose of caffeine roaring through her veins, an Enigma cult zealot's wide-eyed smile dimpling her freckled cheeks, and just enough brimming self-confidence leaking through the picture to make Ernie reach for and like his own stimulant of choice. He didn't reply. He didn't want to come across as friendly. "Daisy," she stated, trying again whilst making herself comfortable in the seat beside him. She thrust a slender, leather-clad hand toward her driver. The old man took a further moment to acknowledge his new wingman, adjusting his cap and taking a long, languid drag on his skinny, hand-rolled cheroot before eventually acquiescing with an "Ernie," gruffly, and superseding it with an unsociable exhalation of tobacco smoke within the seal-tight confines of the cab. Daisy gagged and spluttered, but remained ridiculously chipper. Eventually, and with an all too obvious reluctance, Ernie accepted the proffered hand, but without a smile, and with an overtly tight squeeze intended to intimidate rather than ingratiate. It didn't work, though. Sadly, it really did with this generation. "Nice one," she choked back, pushing a stray frond of strawberry blonde hair from her face and wedging it up beneath her oversized, battered second-hand helmet. She was barely able to contain her excitement at this, her first away mission. She fidgeted in her seat, testing the triggers, aligning the weapon sights and wiping a few stray blood spots from the viewfinder with her thumb. They were always like this on their first runs, Ernie mused. She'd be a liability today, so he'd have to be extra vigilant for both their sakes. If she made it through the day, though, she'd be a different person tomorrow. He'd been driving for so long now, and it was always this way. He'd seen so many fresh-faced and idealistic kids slip into those straps beside him, and he'd left so many of them behind on the road where they'd fallen. They still saw it as a game at this stage. Too much time spent in the simulator, stuck behind a screen, racking up kills set to a heavy metal beat. She'd learn, though, the hard way, unfortunately. If she was lucky. "You're a real legend." "Save it," Ernie snapped, eyes forward as he gunned the engine. "Keep your eyes open and your finger on that trigger if you want to see tomorrow." He refused to catch her slap-down gaze, experience having long taught him the error of getting too pally with his gunners. What was she? 16, 17 at a push? Probably never even been out of the compound, he'd wager. Oh, she'd have been shown footage. She'd know what to expect out there. Or at least she probably thought she did. But the reality didn't always compare, did it? Which was why Ernie was breaking in yet another overzealous whelp, his third one that month. The kid was scanning the dashboard, searching, he'd guess, for a slot which to post her backing track in, headshot by the brain eat that seemed to be the moment's most popular choice with the kids. "I took it out," he said. "We need to focus on the job in hand." Oh, she whimpered, as if he'd just stamped on her puppy. "My round, my rules. Now, disengage the safety on that and pull your goggles down. Here we go." She did as she'd been told without another word. They both heard the double hand slap on the van's rear doors, their signal that they were loaded and ready to move. The gates began to open, 2 men and 2 snipers on each. Ernie inched the vehicle forward in first. As soon as the aperture was van-sized, he rammed it into second and put his foot to the floor, watching the gates closing quickly behind him in his mirror as he set off toward the town. Ernie had been doing this job, man and boy. In the old days, it had been a far more sedate affair. Back then, you hadn't needed wingmen, hadn't needed grills on the windows, an iron bull bar on the front, or razor wire around the roof. He had a radio back then with a tape deck which had played Johnny Cash on a constant loop. In those days, he'd even had the time to build up personal relationships with his customers. This kid would never have believed him if he'd told her that. Quieter times, simpler times, back before greed had destroyed the world. They drove on in silence for the first couple of miles or so, Ernie keeping a steady 85 through the deserted outskirts, the cargo matching the engine for rattles and clanks. Daisy kept her fingers over the trigger of the big gun, her eyes on the road ahead as instructed, ready, willing and able to take that shot when needed. It was rare to find trouble this far out, Ernie knew, but he kept that information to himself as usual. Better for them to be prepared, he reasoned. He hated the fact that they started them so young these days, and he'd told them so. He wasn't a parent himself, but that didn't negate his paternal instincts. They were too young to have to face the horrors that this job threw at them. He knew why they were doing it, of course. The compound were running low. They couldn't breed replacements quickly enough. They'd advertised, of course, it was a good deal in this day and age, well paid and with sought after benefits such as a safe place to live. But who was going to want a job with such a high mortality rate? Best to recruit them in-house, brainwash them with a programme of interactive video games and fill them up with ideals and stimulants. It sickened him, but what could he do? It was their job to keep him alive, not the other way round. Drivers with his experience were an even rarer commodity than gunners over 20. As they pulled onto the ring road, they saw their first problem. Well, Ernie saw it. Daisy was a gnat's too slow, clocking it for the first time as its head bounced off the windshield grille, splattering blood and brain juice across the glass. Sorry, you're eating. A finger yanked on the trigger as Ernie's hit the washers. "You gotta be quicker than that," he admonished, though gently over the top of her cuss. "Keep watching. This is where it gets dirty." Around the bend, and there they were, 8 of them, blocking the road. Daisy wasn't about to be caught out twice. She hit 4 of them in her first burst, decapitating them as she'd been taught. Of the remainder, 1 went under the wheels, another was thrown clear on impact with the bonnet, but the remaining 2 had managed to find purchase on the vehicle's windshield grille and were attempting to claw their cadaverous way into the cab. "Lose them, Daisy," Ernie snapped, throwing the van from side to side in the hope of bucking their uninvited passengers. Now you see, it's one thing to blast a computer-animated undead zombie to pixel hell to the strains of a thumping backbeat and a chorus of whoops and chants from your hyped-up comrades, but quite another when you're faced with a slavering reanimated ghoul in the rotting flesh that's able to eat through iron, glass and bone just to get to your brain meat. Your killer instinct can become somewhat distracted, but Daisy's wasn't. "Down!" she hollered at Ernie, who, taken by surprise, did just that, as the projectiles from both sawn-short barrels whizzed past his ear to blow away the glass beside him and the gnashing zombie beyond. She spun the gun and fired ahead, splattering them both with zombie juice and glass crystals. "Nice!" an impressed Ernie appraised. "Now, hold tight, we're about to make our first drop." Ernie pulled the van off the ring road and into a leafy suburban side street, the speedometer dipping slightly to register 65 as they bounced over the traffic calming humps and swerved around abandoned cars and general household detritus. Refuse collection was an even riskier business than theirs. It had therefore become one of the most expensive of the privatised services, and so tended to be monthly rather than weekly. The van screeched to a sudden rubber-melting stop outside a mid-terrace with barred windows. Their movements were fluid and rehearsed. Both left the van in tandem, Daisy taking up a defensive stance beside Ernie, shotgun at chest height, heat-sensing visor pulled down over her eyes. Ernie had the sliding side door open and retrieved 2 bottles of semi-skim, a loaf of wholemeal and a dozen eggs, and was on his way up the cobbled path for number 52 when he heard the first shots being fired. He passed his delivery through the hatch, collected his payment, put the empties in his pockets and spun, pulling his own sidearm to bear as he vaulted the gate and joined Daisy on the street. Between them, they took down 7 targets before jumping back up into the cab and heading for their next drop. Ernie was impressed with his new wingman. Her reactions were fast and effective. Over the course of the morning's deliveries, they took down a total of 24 undead cannibals. Only one of their regulars had required euthanising. Mrs. Orridge, sure of 21 the Gables had been infected, as had her family. Daisy hadn't batted an elongated eyelash at putting down the entire household. He was beginning to warm to her. The journey back west to the dairy compound was uneventful, but the mood was lighter than it had been on the outbound. See, an understanding had passed between them, a bond had begun to form that Ernie felt could probably build into the working symbiosis required to do this job properly. So what happened then? Daisy asked as they sped back along the deserted motorway. I was only a baby when the plague struck, she pressed. Lost my parents. I've never known the world without zombies. Ernie kept his eyes on the road. Greed happened, he said after an uncomfortable pause. He considered his response. When I was a lad, he began to orate, we used to drive these little old electric milk floats, he explained, smiling wistfully at the memory. Top speed, 25 miles an hour, so the milk didn't curdle and we didn't wake everybody up. We all had milkmen in those days. Then along came the big supermarkets, huge shops where you used to be able to buy everything you needed all in one place. Very convenient and cheap. They were able to undercut all the smaller shops, not to mention the dairies. Put us all out of business. We couldn't afford to compete, you see, with their huge corporate buying power. Then once they'd seen us all off, they put their prices up. By then, of course, it was too late for us. Milk rounds had become a thing of the past. But they didn't stop there, did they? They weren't content with ripping us all off. They wanted even more. So they started upping the additives in the food, giving us less and less of the actual product, bulking it up with chemicals and waste products to make it go further for less outlay. The milk became little more than coloured water, but something went wrong. One of the additives started to mutate on contact with human saliva. It started to turn people into cannibals. Within a few months, a third of the world's population had been eaten by another third. The supermarkets closed because they were too big for the current population and because nobody wanted to eat their food or leave their own houses to get it. Food distribution and production returned to the hands of the smaller, independent, organic farmers like us. He turned to Daisy and smiled at her for the first time. So I got my old job back, didn't I? I mean, it's not perfect. It's not the vocation it once was. But you know what they say? Every little helps. Now,